What happens when the most feared Apache warrior is forced to take a woman he never wanted, but discovers in her a light that melts the ice inside him? This isn't just a tale of survival. It's a collision between cultures, a forbidden bond born in the heart of war, and a love that defies everything. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun that bleached the desert floor white as bone. It was the summer of 1867, and the Apache Wars had painted the frontier red with blood and ash. Fort Mallister stood as a lonely outpost against the wilderness, its wooden walls weathered by sandstorms and the constant threat of raids. Inside those walls lived Rebecca Ann Carson, a 23-year-old woman whose auburn hair caught the sunlight like copper wire, and whose green eyes held the determination of someone who had survived more than most men twice her age. Rebecca had arrived at the fort 6 months earlier with her father, Dr. Henry Carson, the post surgeon. Her mother had died during the journey west, succumbing to fever somewhere along the Kansas plains. The loss had hardened something in Rebecca, transformed her from a sheltered Philadelphia girl into a woman who could dress wounds without flinching and stare down death without blinking. She had learned to handle a rifle, to ration water during droughts, and to read the horizon for signs of approaching riders. The frontier demanded strength, and Rebecca had found reserves within herself she never knew existed. The fort's commander, Captain James Rutherford, was a career soldier with gray streaks in his dark beard and eyes that had seen too many battles. He ran Fort Mallister with iron discipline, but even he couldn't prevent the increasing tensions with the Apache bands that roamed the surrounding mountains. The latest conflict had begun 3 weeks ago, when a group of Apache warriors, led by the legendary hunter known as Neshoba, had raided a supply wagon heading to the fort. 2 soldiers had died in the attack, and Captain Rutherford had vowed retribution. Neshoba was a name spoken in whispers around the fort. The soldiers described him as a phantom, a warrior who could track a man across solid rock and disappear into the desert like smoke. They said he was the fiercest hunter among the Chiricahua Apache, a man who had counted more than 50 coups in battle and whose arrows never missed their mark. The Apache respected him as a protector of their people, a defender of the old ways in a world being consumed by the white man's expansion. But to the soldiers at Fort Mallister, he was simply the enemy, a savage to be hunted down and eliminated. Rebecca had heard these stories during the long evenings when soldiers gathered around fires, sharing tales of frontier violence over coffee and tobacco. She had learned to distinguish truth from exaggeration, to separate fact from the mythology that grew around dangerous men. What she knew for certain was that Neshoba had never harmed women or children during his raids, that he took only what his people needed to survive, and that he fought with a code of honor that many white soldiers lacked. This knowledge didn't make him any less dangerous, but it complicated the simple narrative of savagery that Captain Rutherford preferred. The morning everything changed began like any other. Rebecca was in the fort's small infirmary, helping her father organize medical supplies that had arrived in the latest supply train. The wooden building smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a combination that Rebecca had grown to associate with both healing and death. Her hands moved efficiently through bottles and bandages, cataloging everything while her father checked his surgical instruments. "Rebecca," Dr. Carson said, his voice gentle but tired. The past months had aged him considerably, adding new lines to his face and silver to his thinning hair. "I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've adapted to this life. Your mother would be proud too." Rebecca looked up from her work, meeting her father's eyes. "Papa, we don't need to speak of—" The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, shouting voices, the sound of horses, and then Captain Rutherford's bark of command. Rebecca and her father exchanged glances before rushing to the door. What they saw made Rebecca's blood run cold. A group of soldiers had returned from patrol, and they were dragging someone behind them. Not someone, Rebecca realized as she stepped into the harsh sunlight. An Apache warrior, bound at the wrists and ankles, being pulled across the dusty ground like a slaughtered deer. But this was no ordinary captive. Even defeated and restrained, the man possessed a presence that commanded attention. Neshoba was taller than most Apache men Rebecca had seen, standing perhaps 6 feet in height with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build honed by years of survival in the brutal desert. His skin was the color of burnished copper, stretched taut over high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Long black hair fell past his shoulders, partially obscuring a face that was handsome, in a way that seemed almost carved from stone. But it was his eyes that captured Rebecca's attention. Dark as obsidian, they burned with an intelligence and defiance that no amount of rope could diminish. Captain Rutherford stood over the captive warrior, his face flushed with triumph. "Gentlemen," he announced to the gathering crowd of soldiers and civilians, "we have finally captured the infamous Neshoba. This savage has been a thorn in our side for too long, and now he will face justice." Rebecca watched as the captain circled the bound warrior, his hand resting on his saber. Neshoba remained silent, his face impassive despite the ropes cutting into his wrists and the blood trickling from a wound on his temple. There was something magnificent about his refusal to show pain or fear, something that reminded Rebecca of a wild eagle caged but unbroken. "String him up," Captain Rutherford commanded. "We'll make an example of him at dawn." "Captain," Dr. Carson stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "This man is wounded. At least allow me to treat his injuries before we hang him?" Rutherford laughed coldly. "What difference does it make, Doctor? He'll be dead by morning anyway." Rebecca felt something twist inside her chest. She had witnessed frontier justice before, had seen men hanged for lesser crimes than raiding supply wagons. But something about this felt wrong. The way Neshoba held himself, the dignity in his silence, the absence of pleading or begging, it spoke to a strength of character that transcended the simple labels of savage and civilized. The soldiers dragged Neshoba toward a storage building that served as the fort's makeshift jail. As they passed, the Apache warrior's eyes met Rebecca's for just a moment. In that brief connection, she saw something unexpected. Not hatred or rage, but a deep, profound sadness. It was the look of a man who had fought for his people and lost, who knew his death would change nothing in the inevitable tide of history sweeping across the land. That evening, Rebecca couldn't eat dinner. She sat at the rough wooden table in her quarters, pushing food around her plate while her father watched her with concern. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the fort settling in for the night. Soldiers changing guard, horses moving in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote in the hills. "You're troubled," Dr. Carson observed, setting down his fork. "About the Apache." "His name is Neshoba," Rebecca said quietly. "And yes, I'm troubled. They're going to execute him without a trial, without even attempting to understand why he raids our supplies." Her father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Rebecca, this is war. Brutal, senseless war. The Apache fight to preserve their way of life, and we push forward in the name of progress and manifest destiny. There are no easy answers here. Then perhaps we should start looking for difficult ones," Rebecca replied, her green eyes flashing with determination. "Because simply killing each other until one side is extinct doesn't seem like much of a solution." Later that night, Rebecca made a decision that would change her life forever. She waited until the fort had grown quiet, until the guards had settled into their routine patrols. Then, wrapped in a dark shawl, she slipped out of her quarters and made her way toward the storage building where Neshoba was being held. The guard outside the door was young, barely 20, a private named Thomas Wheeler who Rebecca had treated for a snake bite the previous month. He jumped when she appeared from the shadows, his hand moving to his rifle before he recognized her. "Miss Carson, you shouldn't be out here. It's not safe." "Private Wheeler," Rebecca said calmly, "I need to examine the prisoner's wounds. My father is exhausted, and someone needs to ensure the man doesn't die of infection before his execution." The young soldier hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and his respect for the doctor's daughter who had saved his life. Finally, he nodded. 10 minutes, Miss Carson. That's all I can give you." The interior of the storage building was dark and musty, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam. Neshoba sat in the corner, his back against the rough wooden wall, his wrists still bound. He looked up as Rebecca entered, his dark eyes tracking her movements with the wariness of a captured predator. Rebecca set down her medical bag and approached slowly, her hands visible and empty. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly, though she had no idea if he understood English. "I'm a healer. I want to treat your wounds." For a long moment, Neshoba simply stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he spoke. His voice was deep and rich, his English accented but clear. "Why would you help me? Tomorrow your people will hang me. Why waste medicine on a dead man?" Rebecca knelt beside him, pulling supplies from her bag. "Because you're not dead yet, and because it's the right thing to do." She cleaned the wound on his temple with gentle efficiency, noting how he didn't flinch, even though the carbolic acid must have burned. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his body, old wounds from battles and hunts, each one a story of survival. There was a dignity to him that commanded respect, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with character. "You speak English well," Rebecca observed as she worked. "I learned from a missionary," Neshoba replied, "before your soldiers killed him for helping my people." There was no anger in his voice, only stating facts. "Your captain wants me dead, because I fight to protect what little land we have left, because I hunt to feed children who are starving. This is what your people call justice." Rebecca's hands paused in their work. "Not all of us believe this is justice. Some of us see the injustice in what's happening here." Neshoba's eyes studied her face, searching for deception and finding none. "You are different from the others. I see it in your eyes. You have known loss. You understand pain." "My mother died on the journey here," Rebecca said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. "I watched her fade away day by day, unable to help her. So yes, I understand loss." "Then you understand why I fight," Neshoba said. "My people are dying, not from bullets, but from hunger and disease and broken promises. I fight because I must, because if I do not, I dishonor those who came before me." They talked through the night, their conversation flowing from topic to topic. Neshoba told her about his childhood in the mountains, about learning to track deer before he could walk steadily, about the Apache belief that all living things were connected in a great circle of life. Rebecca shared stories of Philadelphia, of a world so different from the desert that it might as well have been another planet, of her dreams of becoming a real doctor at a time when women were barely allowed to assist. As dawn approached, Rebecca realized something extraordinary had happened. In the space of a few hours, this Apache warrior had transformed from an abstract enemy into a real person, complex, intelligent, and deeply human. The realization terrified her because she knew what the morning would bring. "I have to go," she said reluctantly, gathering her supplies. "The guards will be changing soon." Neshoba nodded, his face grave. "Thank you, Rebecca Carson. You have given me a gift tonight. You have reminded me that not all white people are the same, that some still possess honor and kindness." Rebecca stood, but found herself unable to leave. "There has to be a way to stop this. There has to be something." "There is no way," Neshoba interrupted gently. "Your captain has made his decision. I accept my fate. I only ask that you remember our conversation, that you remember I was more than the savage they will say I was." Rebecca left the storage building with tears streaming down her face. She returned to her quarters and waited for dawn, her mind racing through impossible plans and hopeless scenarios. But as the sun began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, she heard the commotion that meant the execution was about to begin. She couldn't watch. She stayed in her room, hands pressed over her ears to block out the sounds. But then came shouting, the thunder of hoofbeats and gunfire. Rebecca rushed to her window and saw chaos erupting across the fort. A band of Apache warriors had attacked, emerging from the desert like avenging spirits. They rode with deadly precision, their arrows finding targets with lethal accuracy. But this wasn't a raid for supplies or revenge. This was a rescue mission, and at its center was a warrior Rebecca would later learn was Neshoba's younger brother, a fierce fighter named Elan. The fort's soldiers scrambled to defend themselves, but they had been caught completely by surprise. In the confusion, the storage building's door burst open, and Neshoba emerged, his bonds cut by one of the rescuers. For a moment he stood in the center of the chaos, and his eyes found Rebecca at her window. Their gazes locked across the distance, and something passed between them. a recognition, a promise, an acknowledgement of the impossible connection they had forged. Then Captain Rutherford appeared, his pistol drawn, aimed directly at Neshoba's back. Rebecca didn't think. She grabbed her father's rifle from its place by the door, threw open her window and fired. The shot went wide, deliberately missing both men, but it was enough to make Rutherford turn. In that split second, Neshoba disappeared into the swirl of dust and horses. The raid lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, Neshoba and his rescuers had vanished into the desert, leaving behind 3 wounded soldiers and a fort in complete disarray. Captain Rutherford was apoplectic with rage, demanding to know who had fired the shot that allowed Neshoba to escape. Rebecca said nothing. She returned her father's rifle to its place and sat down, her hands trembling with the enormity of what she had done. She had aided the enemy, had directly interfered with military justice. If anyone discovered the truth, she could be court-martialed, imprisoned, or worse. Days passed. The fort increased its patrols, doubled its guards, and waited for retaliation that never came. Rebecca went about her duties in the infirmary, treating minor injuries and organizing supplies, all while replaying that night's conversation over and over in her mind. She had expected to forget Neshoba, to let him fade into memory like so many other brief encounters on the frontier. Instead, he occupied her thoughts constantly, his words echoing in her quiet moments. 2 weeks after the raid, something extraordinary happened. Rebecca was collecting medicinal herbs near the creek that supplied the fort with water when she sensed she was being watched. She turned slowly and found Neshoba standing at the edge of the cottonwoods, as silent and sudden as a shadow. Her heart leaped into her throat not from fear but from something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to name. "You should not be here," she whispered, glancing back toward the fort. "If they see you, I know the risk," Neshoba said, moving closer. "But I had to come. I had to thank you for what you did. You saved my life." "I only fired a warning shot," Rebecca protested. "Your brother and his warriors did the rescuing." "No," Neshoba shook his head. "You saved my life before that, in the storage building. You gave me hope when I had none. You reminded me that there is still good in this world, even in the midst of war." He paused, his dark eyes intense. "And you risked everything to give me one more chance to live. That is a debt I can never repay." They stood there, 2 people from different worlds, separated by culture and conflict, and yet drawn together by something neither could fully explain. The afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling them both in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Rebecca knew she should run, should alert the fort, should do anything except stand there staring into the eyes of the man she was supposed to consider an enemy. But she couldn't move. She was caught, held by the gravity of a connection that defied all logic and reason. "I think of you," Neshoba said softly. "Every day since that night I think of the woman with hair like fire and eyes like new grass. The woman who sees me as a person, not just as Apache or enemy or savage. Do you—" He hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his strong features. "Do you think of me?" Rebecca's answer came without thought, from a place deeper than reason. "Yes. God help me, yes." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to fully explore. Neshoba took another step closer, close enough that Rebecca could see the flecks of warmth in his dark eyes, could smell the scent of sage and leather that clung to him. "This is impossible," Rebecca whispered, but she didn't step back. "Many things are impossible until they happen," Neshoba replied. The sun rising in the west, rain falling up instead of down. An Apache warrior and a white woman finding— He paused, searching for words. "Finding something worth fighting for." "What are you saying?" Rebecca's voice was barely audible. "I am saying that I want to know you. Not just from one conversation in the dark, but truly know you. Your thoughts, your dreams, your fears. I am saying that you have awakened something in me that I thought had died with my wife." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You were married?" "I was," Neshoba said, pain flickering across his face. "She died 3 winters ago, killed by soldiers during a raid on our village. I thought my heart had turned to stone after that, that I would never feel anything again except duty to my people. But then I met you and I felt the stone beginning to crack. They began meeting in secret after that. Rebecca would slip away from the fort under the pretense of gathering herbs or checking the water supply, and Neshoba would be waiting in the cottonwoods. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, their grief. He taught her Apache words, and she taught him more English. He showed her how to read the signs in nature, how to track animals, how to find water in the desert, how to move silently through the landscape. She told him about medicine and science, about the larger world beyond the frontier, about ideas and philosophies he had never encountered. With each meeting, their connection deepened. Rebecca found herself falling for this fierce, gentle warrior who carried such contradictions within him. He could track a deer for days without rest, could fight with deadly skill when necessary, and yet his hands were infinitely gentle when they touched a wounded bird or braided sweetgrass. He spoke of war with sadness rather than pride, of violence as a last resort rather than a first choice. He was everything the soldiers at the fort said Apache warriors weren't: thoughtful, principled, and capable of tremendous tenderness. For Neshoba, Rebecca represented something he had thought lost forever: hope for a future that involved more than just survival. Her intelligence challenged him, her compassion moved him, and her courage in defying her own people to meet him spoke to a strength of character he deeply respected. When he looked at her, he didn't see the white woman who represented everything that threatened his way of life. He saw Rebecca, unique, irreplaceable, worth any risk. But their secret meetings couldn't last forever. Someone at the fort had noticed Rebecca's frequent absences, had started asking questions. Captain Rutherford, still bitter about Neshoba's escape, had become suspicious. He assigned men to watch Rebecca, to track her movements. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. The crisis came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. Rebecca and Neshoba were sitting by the creek, their hands intertwined, talking about impossible dreams of peace between their peoples, when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Neshoba was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Rebecca and the threat. Captain Rutherford emerged from the trees with 6 armed soldiers. His face was twisted with rage and something else: vindication. "So it's true," he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "The good doctor's daughter has been consorting with the enemy. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." "Captain, please." Rebecca stood, her voice steady despite her fear. "You don't understand?" "I understand perfectly," Rutherford spat. "I understand that you are a traitor, that you have been meeting with this savage, probably feeding him information about our defenses, our patrols, our weaknesses." "That's not true," Rebecca protested. "We've never discussed military matters. We've only—" "Silence." Rutherford's pistol was drawn now, aimed at Neshoba. "You savage! Step away from her!" Neshoba didn't move. His hands were open and empty, but his body was coiled, ready to spring into action if necessary. "If you wish to punish someone, punish me," he said calmly. "Rebecca has done nothing wrong. She is innocent of any crime." "Innocent?" Rutherford laughed bitterly. "She aided in your escape. She's been meeting you in secret for weeks. She's betrayed her own people for—" He looked between them, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "Dear God, you care for each other. This isn't just about trading information. This is something else entirely." The soldiers muttered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Rebecca felt the weight of their judgment, but when she looked at Neshoba, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the man standing before her, the man she had come to love despite every logical reason not to. "Yes," Rebecca said clearly, her chin lifted in defiance. "I care for him. I care for Neshoba more than I have cared for anyone in my life. And if that makes me a traitor, then so be it." Captain Rutherford's face purpled with rage. "You will both face the consequences of your actions. Savage, you will be executed at dawn. And you, Miss Carson, will be court-martialed for treason and consorting with the enemy. Your father will be— You will do nothing." A new voice cut in. Everyone turned to see Dr. Henry Carson emerging from the trees, his medical bag in hand. He had clearly been following his daughter, and his face showed a complex mix of emotions: disappointment, understanding, and determination. "Henry," Rutherford began, I'm sorry you have to see this, but your daughter, my daughter, Dr. Carson interrupted firmly, has shown more wisdom and compassion than all of us combined. She has seen past the labels we use to dehumanize each other and recognized the humanity in this man. And now I see it too. The doctor walked forward and stood beside Rebecca, facing down the captain. You want to execute Neshoba? Fine, but you'll have to court-martial me as well, because I support my daughter's choice completely. And before you do that, consider this. I am the only qualified surgeon within 100 miles. If you get rid of me, the next wounded soldier will have no one to treat him. The next outbreak of fever will run unchecked through the fort. You'll be condemning your own men to death. Rutherford's jaw worked silently. He knew Dr. Carson was right. The fort couldn't function without a surgeon, and there was no way to replace him quickly. This is treason, he said finally, but his voice had lost its certainty. This is humanity, Dr. Carson replied. Something we seem to have forgotten in our rush to conquer this land. I propose a different solution. Over the next hour, an unprecedented negotiation took place in that cottonwood grove. Dr. Carson proposed that Neshoba and Rebecca be allowed to leave the territory together, to go somewhere far from the conflict where they could build a life. In exchange, Neshoba would convince his people to stop raiding the fort's supply lines, would serve as a mediator to prevent further bloodshed. It was an imperfect solution, one that satisfied no one completely, but it offered a path forward that didn't end in execution and heartbreak. Captain Rutherford resisted at first, but eventually the practical reality of the situation wore him down. He needed Dr. Carson too much to risk losing him, and perhaps, in some deeply buried part of himself, he was tired of the endless cycle of violence. He agreed to the terms, but with conditions. Rebecca and Neshoba had to leave immediately, had to travel far enough that their presence wouldn't be a constant reminder to the soldiers of what they would see as betrayal. 3 days later, as the sun rose over the Arizona desert, Rebecca stood outside Fort Mallister for the last time. She wore traveling clothes and carried only what could fit in a single pack. Her father stood beside her, tears streaming down his weathered face. They had said their goodbyes the night before, but the reality of separation was harder than either had anticipated. You're sure about this? Dr. Carson asked one last time. You're giving up everything. Your home, your life, your future in civilized society. I'm not giving up anything, Papa, Rebecca said, embracing him tightly. I'm choosing a different kind of future, one built on love and hope instead of hatred and war. Isn't that worth any sacrifice? Neshoba waited on his horse a short distance away, giving father and daughter their private moment. When Rebecca finally pulled away and walked toward him, he reached down and pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid strength of him, and knew she was making the right choice. They rode west, away from the fort, away from the conflict, toward a future neither could predict, but both were willing to face together. Behind them, soldiers watched from the fort walls, their expressions unreadable. Ahead lay mountains and desert, challenges and uncertainties, but also freedom and possibility. As they crested a ridge and the fort disappeared from view, Neshoba reined in his horse. He turned to look at Rebecca, his dark eyes soft with an emotion that transcended language or culture. Are you afraid? He asked. Rebecca smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Terrified, she admitted, but also more alive than I've ever been. Where will we go? North, Neshoba said, to the high country where my mother's people live. They are peaceful, far from the conflict. We can build a life there, if you wish it. I wish it, Rebecca said. Then, with a courage born of love and newfound freedom, she added, I love you, Neshoba. I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I love you with everything I am. Neshoba's response was to pull her around and kiss her, a kiss that contained all the passion and tenderness and promise of their impossible love. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, both were smiling. I love you, Rebecca Carson, Neshoba said, his voice thick with emotion. You are my sunrise after the longest night, my rain after the driest summer. You have given me back my heart when I thought it was lost forever. They rode on through that day and the next, traveling through landscapes of breathtaking beauty, red rock canyons, pine forests, meadows carpeted with wildflowers. At night they made camp under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and they talked and dreamed and planned. Neshoba taught Rebecca more of his language, his customs, his way of seeing the world. Rebecca shared her knowledge of medicine, her stories of the wider world, her hopes for a future where their children, if they had children, could live without fear or hatred. Weeks later, they arrived in the high country, in a valley where a small band of Apache lived in harmony with the land. Neshoba's mother, a dignified woman with silver hair and wise eyes, welcomed Rebecca without judgment. She saw what her son saw, a good woman with a strong heart who would stand beside him through whatever trials lay ahead. The village held a ceremony to welcome Rebecca and to bless the union of this unlikely couple. As the sun set on that day, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson and gold, Rebecca and Neshoba stood together before the gathered people. They spoke their vows in both English and Apache, promising to honor each other, to cherish each other, to build a life based on love and mutual respect. When the ceremony ended and the celebration began, Neshoba pulled Rebecca into his arms and held her close. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked softly. Rebecca looked around at the mountains rising against the twilight sky, at the people who had welcomed her with open hearts, at the man who held her with such tenderness and strength. She thought of the life she had left behind, the restrictions, the expectations, the narrow path that had been laid out for her. Then she looked into Neshoba's eyes and saw their future reflected there. "Not a single one," she said. "This is where I belong. With you. Always with you." They built a home in that valley, a small cabin of logs and stone where they lived and loved and grew together. Rebecca used her medical knowledge to help the village, treating injuries and illnesses, teaching others what she knew. Neshoba hunted and provided for them, but he also spent long hours simply talking with Rebecca, sharing thoughts and dreams, building the kind of partnership that transcended cultural boundaries. Years would pass. They would face challenges, the changing world, the continued conflict between Apache and settlers, the struggles of building a life between two cultures. But they would face them together, united by a love that had defied expectation and overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They would have children, beautiful children who carried the best of both their heritages, and they would grow old together in that valley, their love deepening with each passing season until it became the stuff of legend. But all of that was still to come. On that first night in the village, as they lay together under a canopy of stars, all that mattered was the present moment, the warmth of Neshoba's arms around her, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, the absolute certainty that she had found her home not in a place, but in a person. "Tell me a story," Rebecca whispered into the darkness. Neshoba smiled and began to speak in Apache, his voice a low rumble that soothed and excited her in equal measure. He told her the old stories of his people, of how Coyote stole fire for mankind, of how Raven brought light to the world, of how love could bridge any divide if hearts were brave enough to try. And Rebecca listened, understanding now not just the words but the deeper truths they contained, feeling herself becoming part of something larger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. In the end, what Captain Rutherford and the soldiers at Fort Mallister had seen as betrayal, Rebecca and Neshoba knew as salvation. They had found each other across the widest divide imaginable, had chosen love over hatred, understanding over ignorance, hope over despair. And in doing so, they had created something miraculous, a future built not on the ruins of war, but on the foundation of two hearts that had recognized in each other the missing piece that made them whole. Their love story would echo through the generations, a testament to the power of seeing past differences to the essential humanity that connects all people. And though the world around them would continue to change, though conflicts would rage and borders would shift, the love between Rebecca Carson and Neshoba would remain constant, fierce and tender, impossible and inevitable, a light shining in the darkness to remind all who heard their story that love, in the end, conquers all.